Futurist Music Technical Manifesto by Francesco Balilla Pratella, March 29, 1911. All innovators, logically speaking, have been futurists in relation to their time. Palestrina would have thought that Bach was crazy, and Bach would have thought Beethoven the same, and Beethoven would have thought Wagner equally so. Rossini liked to boast that he had finally understood the music of Wagner by reading it backward. Verdi, after listening to the overture of Tannhauser, wrote to a friend that Wagner was mad. So we stand at the windows of a glorious mental hospital, even while we unhesitatingly declare that counterpoint and the fugue, which even today are still considered the most important branches of musical instruction, represent no more than ruins belonging to a history of polyphony, one that could cover the period running from the Flemish composers to Bach. Harmonic polyphony, which replaces them with the rational fusion of harmony and counterpoint, will once and for all prevent the composer from dividing himself between two cultures, one dead for some centuries, the other contemporaneous, these two being irreconcilable with each other because their products are very different in manner of feeling and conception. The second culture, for logical reasons of progress and evolution, is already a remote and unattainable consequence of the first, by having summarized, transformed, and surpassed it by a great distance. Harmony, which historically was only implied in melody, sounds following one another according to the diverse modes of the scale, was born when each melodic note was considered in relationship to the combination of all the other sounds in the mode of the scale to which it belonged. In that way it became understood that melody is the expressive synthesis of a harmonic succession. Today people cry and regret that young musicians no longer know how to discover melodies, no doubt alluding to those of Rossini, Bellini, Verdi, or Ponchielli. Such musicians conceive of melody harmonically. They hear harmony through diverse and ever more complex combinations and successions of sounds, and thus they find new sources of melody. But it is time to finish once and for all with being contemptible imitators of a past that no longer has a reason for existing, venal solicitors of the public's low taste. We futurists proclaim that the diverse modes of old scales, the various sensations of major, minor, augmented, diminished, and even the more recent modes of scales for whole tones, are none other than simple details of a unique harmonic and atonal mode of a chromatic scale. Moreover, we declare that the values of consonance and dissonance are non-existent. Futurist melody will draw from the innumerable combinations and various relationships that derive from them. This melody will be none other than a synthesis of harmony, similar to the ideal line that is formed by the incessant surging of 1,000 waves with unequal crests. We futurists proclaim that progress and the victory of the future will consist in researching and realizing the enharmonic mode, whereas chromatism only lets us take advantage of all the sounds contained in a scale that is divided into minor and major semitones, and harmony contemplates still more minute subdivisions of a tone, and hence it is not only furnishes our renewed sensibilities with the maximum number of specifiable and combinable sounds, but also new and more varied relations among chords and timbres. But above all, enharmony makes possible enharmonic intervals that have natural and instinctive intonation and modulation, something unachievable within the present tempered system that we wish to overcome. We futurists have long had a liking for these enharmonic intervals, which we hear in the false dissonance of an orchestra when the instruments play out of tune and in spontaneous popular songs that are sung without musical training. The rhythm of dance, monotonous, limited, decrepit, and barbarous. Its domination of polyphony will have to give way to a free and polyrhythmic procession and be limited to remaining only a characteristic detail of it. Even uneven and mixed tempos should be considered as relational among themselves, in the same way we now regard the relations among binary, ternary, ternary binary, and binary ternary. One or two bars in uneven time placed in the middle or at the end of a musical phrase, which is an even or mixed tempo, or vice versa. These should no longer be condemned by the false and ridiculous law of continuous steady rhythm, a despicable umbrella used by all the impotent people who teach in conservatories. The alternation and succession of all tempos and all possible rhythms will find their proper balance only within the genius and aesthetic sense of the creative artists. Knowledge of instrumentation should be acquired through experience. Instrumental composition should be conceived instrumentally, imagining and hearing a particular orchestra for each particular and diverse musical condition of the mind. All this will be possible when the conservatories, lyceums, and academies have been deserted and their closure agreed on. Then musical studies will acquire a character of absolute freedom and meet the necessity of experience. The masters of today, transformed into the experts of tomorrow, will be their students' guides and objective collaborators, no longer unconsciously corrupting their budding talents by suppressing them with their own personalities or imposing on them their own errors and criteria. For man, absolute truth consists in what we feel as a human being. The artist humanizes nature by interpreting it purely. Sky, waters, forests, rivers, mountains, crisscrossing ships and swarming cities are transformed by the soul of the musician into marvelous and potent voices that sing with human tones the desires of man. His passions for joy and suffering, so revealing by the power of art the common and indissoluble chain that links him with all the rest of nature. Musical forms are nothing more than the aspects and fragments of a unique and complete whole. Every form exists in relation to the potential expression and development of the generative emotional motif, and to the sensibility and intuition of the creative artist. Rhetoric and bombast issue from the disproportion between the emotional motifs and its explicable form, produced in the majority of cases by the blinding influences of tradition, culture, environment, and often by intellectual limitations. The emotional motif in itself imposes on the musician its own formal and synthetic explication, synthesis being the cardinal property of expression and musical aesthetics. The symphony is constituted by the contrast between several emotional motifs and the relation among their expressive characters and the potentials for expansion and development. The Futurist considers its maximist forms to be the symphonic poem, orchestral and vocal, and the opera. The pure symphonist, with free and ample imagination, derives his development, contrasts, lines, and forms from his emotional motifs, paying attention to no criterion other than his artistic sense of balance, proportion, and reaching his goal in the complex of expressive means and aesthetics proper to pure musical art. This sense of futurist balance can be nothing other than the achievement of the maximum intensity of expression. The opera composer, in contrast, draws all the reflexes of the other arts within the orbit of musical aesthetics and inspiration, a powerful concurrence tending to multiply the expressive and communicative efficacies of his work. The opera composer has to take into account these secondary elements in the wake of his aesthetic and musical inspiration. Because the human voice is our own and comes from us, it is the maximum means of expression and should be circumfused with the orchestra in a sonorous atmosphere full of all the voices of nature rendered through art. The vision of the poem, written as a scenario, leaps into the imagination of the creative artist by virtue of a particular necessity, arriving from the will to explicate the generative emotional and inspirational motifs. The dramatic or tragic poem cannot be conceived through music if it isn't the result of a musical state of mind, or a single vision derived from the musical aesthetics. The opera composer, simply in linking his words all together, is creating rhythms, is already creating musically, and so becomes the only author of his own opera. If instead he sets someone else's words to music, he is stupidly renouncing his own wellspring of original inspirations, and taking over from someone else the rhythmic part of his melodies. Free verse is the only form suitable for a libretto, because it's free of limitations of rhythm, and accented syllables repeated monotonously in restricted and inadequate forms. In free verse, the polyphonic wave of human poetry finds all the rhythms, accents, and modes needed to express itself freely, a fascinating symphony of words. The freedom of rhythmic expression is characteristic of futurist music. Man and the multitudes of men on the stage must no longer imitate common speech, but should sing as we do when unconscious of time or place and seized by a deep impulse to swell and dominate. We instinctively burst out an essential and riveting human language, song that is natural and spontaneous, song without measured rhythms or intervals, those artificial limits to expression that almost make us regret the power of words. 1. Melody must be conceived as a synthesis of harmony, and the harmonic definitions of major, minor, augmented, and diminished should be considered simply as elements within a single atonal chromatic mode. 2. Enharmony should be considered as a magnificent conquest of futurism. 3. We must break the domination of dance rhythms. They should be considered as possible elements within free rhythm, just as the rhythm of a hendecasyllable can be an element within the stanza and free verse. 4. With the fusion of harmony and counterpoint, we must create polyphony in an absolute sense, something never in use until today. 5. We must make use of all the expressive and dynamic values of the orchestra and view instrumentation as part of incessantly mobile universal sonority, constituting a unique whole through the effective fusion of all its parts. 6. We must regard musical forms as following form and dependent on the generative emotional motifs. 7. We must not confuse symphonic form with the usual traditional, dead, and buried schemes of the symphony. 8. We must conceive of the opera as a symphonic form. 9. We must make it an absolute requirement that the musician be the author of the dramatic or tragic poem for his music. The symbolic action of the poem should leap to the musician's imagination, impelled by his wish to explicate emotional motifs. 10. We must recognize free verse as the only means of attaining a criterion of polyrhythmic freedom. 11. Music must contain all the new attitudes of nature, always tamed by man, in different ways through incessant scientific discoveries. It must render the musical spirit of the masses, the grand industrial factories, trains, transatlantic steamers, battleships, automobiles, and airplanes. It must add the domination of the machine and the victorious reign of electricity to the great central motifs of the musical poem.